Many of you will appreciate at this time we feel like we're being force-fed nonsense. So I just wanted to grab 3 quick examples that are actually happening today, they're in the headlines today, that really help to explain how we recognise we're being force-fed madness. And the reality shows it's utterly insane. I also wanted, clearly, to make these daffodils the focus of the whole video. So that's why they're perched here on this chair next to me. You'll know that I love daffodils. I won't go into the reasons why, but I do. So anyway, first up, the green agenda. Many of us recognise net zero is a load of old trot. Many of us recognise that we don't want to give up our cars, and that in fact cars are really integral to our feeling of being free, or at least they used to be. Cars, when it was my dad or granddad's, were a sort of sense of pride. You go out and polish your car on a Sunday. It mattered to the family that you had this car that you could go about in. You can get in a car, fill it up with petrol and disappear to wherever you want to. In America, you can get in your car and drive to a new state and set up a life there. So taking away of cars is about so much more than just changing over to electric. It's about taking away freedoms, your freedoms to go where you like, when you like, how you like, and whatever speed you like. This idea that we're all going to end up kind of buying into some sort of timeshare on a car that turns up and we borrow it very much like a rental car is a horrible idea for people who remember what freedom felt like. Well, today, an electric vehicle has blown up, set on fire, whatever, on the tunnel on the way to Heathrow. And this happens more and more. If you speak to anybody that works in the fire service, they say, don't get an electric vehicle. If you speak to anybody that works in the AA or RAC or any kind of road recovery program, they'll say, don't get an electric vehicle, because once you arrive on scene, they're almost impossible to try and correct or amend. They always have to be carted off because there's nothing available for you to fix, and certainly not safely. And then if you work or live amongst anybody who's a mechanic or works at a garage, as I do, they will tell you the thing they hate to get in as an electric car, because they're really difficult to kind of decide what the problem is, because you can't follow the normal routes of a vehicle to solve or fix the problem, and then you can't fix it easily. There's just so many reasons why it doesn't make any sense at all. And that's before you get into the whole ridiculous thing about the charging stations and all the infrastructure required to put charging stations in place. I mean, how often do you see large generators running off of power in order to have a charging station for something that we're told is green or clean or whatever? It's that things that are obvious are punching us in the face at the same time as we're being told electric vehicles are the answer. Well, of course they're not. Another story that's happening today, it's headline news today. Lab-grown foods will be available here in the UK or be pushed into the marketplace within 2 years. And this is another moment. This isn't just about vegans or vegetarians that don't want to eat meat but still want something that's a bit like meat, which I think is nonsense in itself. Like, if you're a vegetarian and you don't want to eat meat, why are you eating stuff that's pretending to look like meat? That makes no sense. But this pushing of lab-grown stuff at the same time as our farmers are being punished and our farmers are being treated in a way that is punitive. It's punitive for them to try and work the land. It's punitive for them to try and raise cattle. It's so hard for them to try and make any money off livestock these days or off dairy. Everything is being pushed in the media, in advertising, away from natural stuff that hasn't been processed. And when you read beyond lab grown, it's actually cells being fermented in tanks. And if you look at it, so if you were just told to eat it as it is, these are huge tanks with this white stuff, which is cells that they've cultivated, often with gene amendments. They fiddle with the genes of these cells that they get from wherever they get them from to cultivate this stuff. They grow these cells in huge fermentation tanks, and then they have to process that muck into something that resembles food and colour it and shape it and form it into, say you want a steak, they have to, create that steak out of the muck that comes out of the fermentation tanks. And before you get into any argument about what carbon that emits or it doesn't, why now would we be using and pushing processed food? The whole thing has been to get away from processed food. Processed food is bad for people. You mustn't eat processed food. Don't feed your processed food to the kids. Try and get stuff that's natural, that's, as few steps as possible from source. Well, now the government is actively foisting onto people highly processed, fermented cells that have never been near the source. That's another example of how what we see happening in our lives is the opposite to what we know is right. And then the final thing is a performative political thing, and it's happening today as well, which is Rachel Reeves, ceramic bobhead, hair by Lego, the Chancellor, says she's coming out tough to get 6 billion in savings from the budgets of people who claim welfare. So maybe it's disability benefit, maybe it's PIP, personal independent payments, maybe it's, I think that was formerly universal credit, I'm unsure, I don't claim any benefits. She's claiming that they're going to take 6 billion back off of that budget. Now, given that budget is around 380 billion in the very near future, that barely scratches the surface. And this is kind of the point I'm getting to. This is performative politics. It's not really going to happen. It certainly isn't going to make a difference. But the Labour Party know that to win over more of a centrist vote, they need to perform the idea that work matters more than sitting at home and doing nothing. In fact, the opposite is true. The grand plan for us all is that we become entirely dependent on the state. Because as with communism, when you're dependent entirely on the state has total control. And for people like me, who've been called every name under the sun, and it doesn't matter one bit, and it absolutely doesn't matter if you disagree with what I'm about to say, or you need to call me a name because of what I'm about to say. I've been called the biggest bitch in Britain, and now I get called a drunk or a mad woman, or, she's off her head, that one. That doesn't matter what the label is. It doesn't change. It's on you that you need to put a label on me to make your stuff okay. Regardless, for me, lockdowns were all about teaching people to be entirely dependent on the state. So many people enjoyed the lockdown summer. Being paid by the state to sit at home in their gardens and have a nice time was all part of the education, and it's worked brilliantly. Before lockdowns, around 2,000 people a month-ish were claiming or adding to the PIP claimants. So around 2,000 people a month signed on to say, I want to just be dependent on the government. Lockdown happened, and now that figure is closer to 6,000 people a month that say, I'm giving up on life, I'm giving up on being personally responsible or personally accountable, and I'm going to have the government pay me to live. Now, I know there'll be people in the comments say, well, Katie, you don't realise I've got no legs, no arms, and I need help. Yes, I get it. Individual cases differ. You will feel personally got at if this is you, and I feel that you have every right to respond in the comments. But tell me how it could possibly be that in the month before lockdowns, there were 2,000 additional claimants a month, and now there's 6,000 just in that brief period. And the answer is, I think, it was an education programme designed to make people dependent on the state. And how many of you have heard friends say, I'm just going to spend it all, I'm giving up on everything, and when I run out, I'm going to just sign on and be dependent on the government? I've heard it a whole bunch of times from people you would never expect to hear it from, because the disincentive for being independent or accountable or putting in effort or trying hard, or the difficulties of trying to employ people or be employed, are simply too much. So I think what's happening today is performative, because I think the overall direction that the madness takes us in is to be entirely dependent on the state. The state will eventually pay out universal income for everybody, and everybody will relinquish private property, private car ownership, private ownership of anything. And that's the sort of direction that we've been heading in, certainly for the last decade, if not the last couple. I wanted to pick out those three examples because they're in the news today. I think they perfectly highlight what many of us believe is happening to us as a nation and globally, is that a small club of very powerful people control what's happening on the rest of the planet. And the idea certainly is that us useless meat eaters will own nothing and allegedly be happy.